Marriage, people say, is about togetherness, a bond that weathers time, distance, and change. But for me, it had started to feel like an empty echo, a promise growing faint in the background of my life. My husband was a good man, hardworking, dependable, steady. But he traveled often for work, and each time he left, a silence lingered in our home, slowly stretching the space between us. There was a time I tried to talk to him about it, about the absence I felt and the lonely evenings piling up when he was away. I chose my words carefully, hoping he'd hear the longing beneath them. But my words only stung. He bristled, reminding me how hard he worked for us, and somehow it escalated into a serious quarrel. After that, I learned to keep my feelings to myself, to avoid stirring up that tension between us. But that silence became my companion, leaving me with a heaviness I didn't know how to lift. Then, one evening, I attended a charity event alone. I didn't want to go, but something in me needed a break from my own solitude. That's when I met Chris. Chris was the kind of person who could ease into any room, find his place, and somehow make everyone feel at ease. He was charming in an unassuming way, with a warmth that felt like an open invitation to simply be. We struck up a conversation, mostly small talk at first, but he had a way of listening that made me feel like my words mattered. He shared snippets of his life, his travels, his work, his family. And when he laughed, I noticed a genuine kindness in his eyes. As the night went on, I realized how much I missed being able to talk like this, to feel heard without needing to measure my words. Chris was easygoing, a good storyteller with an endless array of anecdotes from around the world, and surprisingly, an excellent communicator. There was a sensitivity in his words, a way of looking at life that felt refreshing. I'd forgotten what it was like to feel this kind of connection with someone. After that night, I thought that would be the last I'd see of him, but life had other plans. Over the following weeks, we kept running into each other in the neighborhood, at the park, in the grocery store, even at the cafe down the street. It felt like the universe was playing some strange game, bringing him into my life in these little, unexpected moments. And though I told myself it was nothing, a part of me began looking forward to those chance encounters. I never planned for anything serious with Chris. He was just someone who made me feel a little less alone in the moments when my husband was away. And each time we talked, it was as if he filled a small corner of that quiet, empty space inside me. We'd talk about anything and everything, letting the conversation flow without worry or expectation. For a while, it felt harmless, like an escape that I could keep contained. But over time, that escape began to feel less like a choice and more like something I craved. Chris would share stories about the places he'd visited, the people he'd met, the different lives he'd glimpsed along the way. And somehow, he made those stories come alive, as if he could paint each scene with his words. It wasn't just the stories, though. It was the way he seemed to understand, to listen deeply. When he asked about my own life, my own dreams, it felt like he was seeing parts of me that had long been tucked away, hidden beneath the routines of daily life. One afternoon, he suggested we meet at a nearby gallery for a new exhibit he thought I'd enjoy. My husband was traveling again, and I was alone for the weekend. Part of me hesitated, but I told myself it was just an innocent outing. After all, it was a public space, and I'd simply be indulging in my love of art. The gallery was beautiful, each piece brimming with color and emotion. We moved from one painting to the next, talking about art, about life, and somehow about everything else that lingered in the quiet spaces between. At one point, we stopped in front of a painting that seemed to capture a feeling I couldn't quite name, a field of wildflowers under a vast, open sky. Chris leaned in close and said, "This reminds me of you. Something free, beautiful, a bit wild." My breath caught. His words, simple yet intimate, touched a part of me that had felt invisible for so long. I knew then that this connection between us was growing into something more than I had intended, more than I was prepared to handle. But standing there, wrapped in the soft light of the gallery, I felt seen, and I couldn't deny the warmth that filled me in his presence. After the gallery, As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, Chris suggested we grab a bite. I was about to agree when I felt a tug within me, an impulse I couldn't quite understand but felt bold enough to act on. "Why don't we go back to my place?" I heard myself say, my voice soft, almost uncertain, as if testing the weight of the words. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, and then he nodded with a gentle smile. We walked the short distance to my house in silence, each step heavy with anticipation. I hadn't brought anyone into this space, my private sanctuary, for a long time. And here I was, inviting Chris in, opening not just the door to my home but a door I hadn't realized I'd kept so tightly shut within myself. Once inside, I turned on a few lamps, casting a warm glow over the living room. The quiet hum of the evening settled around us as we sank into the couch, side by side, close enough to feel the subtle electricity between us. I offered him a glass of wine, something to ease the tension that was thick in the air. He accepted, his fingers brushing mine as he took the glass, a brief touch that sent a ripple through me. As we sipped, the conversation began to flow, hesitant at first, like testing the depth of a river. But soon, the words came freely. Chris opened up in ways I hadn't expected, sharing pieces of his life that were vulnerable, hidden beneath the surface of his usual charm. He spoke about his loneliness, the quiet ache he carried, how he felt there were parts of himself no one really understood. His voice softened as he admitted to feeling like he was living on the outskirts of his own life, an observer rather than a participant. Listening to him, I felt a pang of recognition, a mirror to my own feelings, to the emptiness I had been carrying alone. I didn't realize until then how starved I was for connection, for the chance to be seen and understood without judgment. And so, I found myself opening up too, sharing struggles I had kept locked away, stories about my marriage, my loneliness, the silences that filled my home each time my husband left. There was a comfort between us, an unspoken understanding that made everything feel natural, even inevitable. We sat there, our words weaving together like threads, creating a quiet, intimate tapestry of shared vulnerability. At some point, I looked up and realized how close we were, our faces only inches apart. His gaze held mine, soft and steady, his eyes searching as if trying to read the unspoken emotions lingering between us. Without thinking, without planning, I felt myself leaning forward. Our breaths mingled, and for a moment, the world fell away. There was no sound, no thought, just the quiet pull of his presence. And then, his lips brushed against mine, tentative and soft, as if he were asking permission with every slight movement. I should have pulled away, should have stopped this before it became something I couldn't take back. But in that moment, the weight of my loneliness, the ache for connection, overpowered any sense of restraint. I let myself sink into the kiss, letting it speak the words I didn't dare say aloud, the longing, the need, the quiet hunger that had been growing within me for so long. The kiss deepened, gentle yet intense, carrying with it all the things we hadn't said. And as we pulled apart, the silence between us felt charged, full of things we couldn't undo, yet somehow couldn't regret in that instant. But as the evening drew to a close, reality settled back in. I was married. I had a life, a commitment, a bond that I couldn't betray. And yet, Chris had filled a space that I didn't know how to fill on my own. Days passed, and I tried to distance myself, to create space between myself and that night. I told myself it was just a moment, a brief lapse, something I could forget if I pushed hard enough. But memories have a way of lingering, especially those that touch the parts of us we try hardest to hide. Chris lingered in my thoughts. His words, his kindness, the way he made me feel like someone who mattered. I could feel his presence in the quiet moments when I was alone in the house, waiting for my husband's return. Every time my husband called, it was a quick check-in or a rushed goodbye, his voice distant, distracted. The familiar silence followed his calls, wrapping around me like an old, worn blanket, a reminder of how alone I felt even in my marriage. And each time, the memories of Chris would surface, filling that silence, his laughter echoing in my mind, his words softening the edges of my loneliness. Then, one of those long, quiet nights, my phone lit up. It was Chris. My heart quickened, a mixture of excitement and fear swirling in my chest. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, but there was a warmth in his tone that melted my resolve. "I was just passing through your neighborhood," he said, his voice casual yet inviting, carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. I hesitated, feeling the conflict tugging at me, but I couldn't deny the flutter of excitement his call brought. There was a part of me that wanted to resist, to tell him I wasn't home or that it wasn't a good time. But in that moment, my loneliness felt sharper than my guilt, and my longing for connection won out. "Come over," I found myself saying, my voice barely above a whisper. When I hung up, a wave of anticipation washed over me, followed by a pang of fear. I knew the hold he had over me, knew that in his presence, my resolve weakened, my boundaries blurred. Yet, even with that knowledge, I couldn't bring myself to turn him away. Minutes later, Chris was at my door. The moment I opened it, I could feel the electricity between us. He stepped inside, his gaze soft and understanding, as if he sensed the internal battle I was waging. We sat on the couch, the same place where we had shared that first vulnerable conversation, and the familiarity of it felt strangely comforting. We talked, falling back into the easy rhythm we always shared, yet beneath our words, there was an unspoken tension, a pull that we both felt but didn't dare acknowledge aloud. And then, as the conversation drifted into silence, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle, reassuring.